I want to talk now to Peter Bleksley, the former Metropolitan Police detective who is with us now. Peter, there's just so much to talk about in terms of the police at the moment, today in particular. But I just want to start with the Met data breach. So we've had the Police Service of Northern Ireland in the last couple of weeks had a major data breach which had over 10,000 bits of information in the public domain, affecting over 10,000 officers and civilians. We've had Norfolk and Suffolk Police have had a reference to a data breach a couple of years ago. We've had this one now with the Met as well, involving a supplier a third-party supplier who did warrant cards. I mean, you would imagine they would be quite tight with the data. What's going on here, and how worried are you in terms of, we heard earlier in regard to the National Air Traffic Control System, could there be foreign actors here, could there be sabotage? Some of this is human error, but what do you think it all kind of adds up to together for the police?
Collectively, it's catastrophic, and it might be personally for individual officers. I'll get onto that in a moment, if I may. But when we look at this, a warrant card is the most important piece of kit a police officer will be issued with. You get it when you start in the police, and you keep it with you all the time, and you hand it in when you leave the police. It's your warrant. It's what grants you the powers of a constable, being able to arrest people, and it's what gets you into sensitive buildings and into other sensitive parts of already sensitive buildings. It's your ID. And of course, the same applies for the staff passes, because the Met's got thousands of civilian staff, and their passes that allow access into secretive and confidential places, including, of course, the House of Commons. So you imagine someone, if they had a rogue warrant card, for example.
Yes.
However, sticking with the data, the Met were very swift to say officers' addresses are not involved in this breach, which of course comes courtesy of this third-party provider.
Yes.
However, it's 2023. Many police officers live with their parents, the younger officers. They're not earning enough money to get on the property ladder. They still live with mum and dad. Now, if that officer has taken the step to have them removed from the voters' register, for example, but the parents haven't, and you have a surname like mine, for example, which is slightly unusual, criminals are going to be able to trace where police officers live.
And some of them in very sensitive situations. I'm sure it's worrying not just for the bobby on the beat, but particularly for people who work in serious organised crime, for example, dealing with gangs, dealing with that organised crime, dealing as well people who are in Parliament, for example, who are worried about terrorism threats. There'll be a lot of worry happening at the moment from ordinary officers who usually do an absolutely great job. But that, of course, can't really be vocalised. It can be vocalised by people like you who are retired, but the officers in there, they'll all be talking about this. I'm sure that you've had many conversations of people who are very, very worried about what would happen to them and their families.
There's a lot of anger out there about this, a lot of anger, because officers feel they've been betrayed. Remember officers who guard the King 24/7. Their data will potentially be in the hands of criminals. Officers working undercover in the sort of roles that I did. And my life was completely turned upside down and to a large degree wrecked when I was subject to a data breach.
So what happened to you, Peter? Tell us your experience.
Well, that was the theft of a report. Somebody compiled a confidential report, and instead of putting my undercover number into the report, they foolishly put my real name. So that was the first major error. Then they printed it off. Error number 2. Number 3, they took it out of the police building. They had it in the back of an unmarked police car whilst they went shopping. That's when I started to conspiracy theorise. And I bet your viewers and listeners are now guessing and shouting at the telly saying, yeah, we know what happened next. Yes, you're absolutely right. That car got broken into, and that report was stolen. There was already a pre-existing threat to assassinate me. So if that threat got married up with the report, then they'd have known my name. I'd have been pretty easy to find.
So this was a sort of analogue way, essentially. It was literally a piece of paper with your details on it that got out into the public domain. But the same thing has happened in a more kind of up-to-date, modern, kind of 2023 way with loads of officers. So tell us the kind of emotions you went through. Tell us the kind of experience that you had when that happened? I mean, presumably you were just shocked and angry when it originally occurred.
Well, I was driving home one night after work, and I got a phone call from one of the bosses at Scotland Yard who simply said, "Don't go home." I said, "Do what, Governor? What do you mean, don't go home?" He said, "I can't tell you what it's about. Make sure you're in here at 8 o'clock tomorrow, 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." He said, "Use one of your undercover identities, book into a hotel. Who'd you live with?" I said, "My girlfriend." He said, "Get her to go to the flat, pack an overnight bag, but you do not go to that flat, move into the hotel, and we'll explain what happened tomorrow morning." Well, of course, I got there at 8 o'clock, not 9 o'clock, and my mate gave me a copy of the report that had been stolen, and I was utterly flabbergasted. If it had happened today, it would be called a data breach. Back then, it was a theft of report, so it's kind of, as you say, in an analog age.
But it's the same net effect.
It is, indeed. And by the close of play that day, I had to abandon my home, abandon my identity, abandon the life I kind of thoroughly enjoyed, and a few days later, I was hurriedly parachuted into the witness protection program in a hideout, not a home, under a false name with supporting documentation, and having to live a perpetual lie.
Goodness me, how long did that last for, though?
2 years until I had a catastrophic mental health breakdown, which kind of signified the end of my police career.
Peter, I didn't know that. My goodness, that's horrendous.
It was a really, really deep, dark time. And, of course, I spent a lot of time conspiracy theorising about how this could have all come about.
What happened to the people who screwed up?
They got promoted. Yeah, of course. Policing rewards failure so often.
Yeah, civil service as well, yeah. I mean, yeah. What is... So now when you hear this, when you see these data breaches and so on, what goes through your mind when you're thinking of young officers, when you're thinking of people who do the job you did and people who weren't as high-ranking as you, the bobbies on the beat and so on, the constables? What is your message to them if they're watching or listening to this? Well,
firstly, I am hoping against hope that they are not in hotels tonight, waiting to be parachuted into the witness protection program, because that is pretty miserable. Demand answers, demand representation from the Federation. Do not be fobbed off. Fight for what you deservedly need to get, which is a level of accommodation which is acceptable. Some of the accommodation I was offered, I wouldn't have kept my dog in it if I'd had a dog. And try and remain firm, and don't make the mistake that I made, because I did play a part in my own downfall by way of trying to rationalise the irrationality of it all, sitting there at night staring into the bottom of an empty whiskey glass. That was not a good idea.
Because people see these news stories, they see them, they pop up, we talk about it now for 5 or 10 minutes, but the effects are so much longer lasting on so many people when these things are in the public domain.
They really are. And again, by way of advice to anybody who has been affected, who might be having to relocate, make sure that your employers and you think about the long-term ramifications here, because nobody thought about that in my situation. And of course, if you don't have that long-term vision, I got into a situation that was largely unsustainable in the long term. It simply hadn't been thought out. So avoid knee-jerk reactions.
How did you turn a corner from the mental breakdown that you had? You were relying on alcohol. We're just going to go into the news in about a minute or so, but if you could just tell us briefly how you turned the corner, Peter.
Through the brilliance of the NHS doctors and nurses, because I was put into a lock-in psychiatric ward for 3.5 weeks. There was a lot of wonderful staff, medication, talking to people, and the medical professionals. It was a long road, but I got back there. I still take a tiny maintenance dose of medication now, every day, all these years afterwards. I have no shame in that. If the meds work, blooming well take 'em.